welcome to another Every Tuesday tutorial. In this week's tutorial, we're going to create some typography using paint streaks. And it's a really fun way to show off your type skills, and it's a nice way to gift something that's original artwork. You could make an art print out of this and gift it to someone, or even sell it online if that's something you're interested in. So I'll take you through how to make this exact E using paint streak textures, and we'll just get started. I'm gonna come over here and go File, New. I'm in Photoshop for this week's tutorial, and I'm going to create a document that's 11 inches wide by 8.5 inches tall, and I'm going to keep my resolution at 300, but I'm going to change this to CMYK as if it would actually be used as an art print. So once you have this, just hit OK. And now we need a base, so we need something to trace from. It helps a lot if you're just not freehanding it. That way you have an outcome that looks more like what you're going for. So I'm just going to hit T on my keyboard to activate my type tool. I'm just going to click once and then type the letter E. And I'm going to use the font Botanica Script. And this is the E that I'm going to use as my base, and I'll leave links to all the assets that I'm mentioning in this tutorial in the video description. So make sure to check that out and you'll be able to pick up everything that I mentioned right there. So obviously this is way too small. If I zoom out, I'm just going to hit Command T or Control T on a PC to scale this. I'm going to hold Shift as I click and drag a corner node. Make it nice and big so we've got a really nice base to work off of and we can see all of our details really well. So I've scaled this up to about 550 points. So I'm just going to zoom right back in, and now that I've got my E layer right here, now I can start laying some textures on top of them. So I'm using the paint streak texture kit that I created a few weeks ago, and I will leave a link to that. And I also did give a couple of those away for free, so I'll leave the blog post for where you can pick those free ones up too if you just want to experiment first. So I'm going to go File, Place, and grab one of these. So the first one I'm going to grab is number 20, and it's in the abstract folder of the kit. And I want to keep all of this within the same kind of color family, so I'm using mostly blues for this. That way it seems a little more natural, like it could have actually been painted. If I have too many different colors, it looks a lot more computer generated than freehand, and that's what we really want this to come off as. So I'm going to scale this down slightly, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this somewhere between this angle, because I need it to curve a little bit up here and I need it to curve a little bit down here. So I'm kind of finding some middle ground. That way I don't have to overcompensate on one end or the other. It's kind of the same. I'm going to scale it down a little bit more. And then when I'm happy with the angle that I've rotated it at, I'm just going to hit Return or Enter on my keyboard. Next, I need to be able to see the E behind this paint streak texture, so I'm going to set my layer over here to 50% just so I can see through it. So now that I have it at 50% opacity, I'm going to hit Command T or Control T on a PC to free transform this. And the really awesome thing about using this smart object is I can warp it. So I'm going to right click and choose warp, and whatever I do here I can come back to later. So even if I change something and then hit Enter or Return by accident to commit those changes, I can come back and hit Command T or Control T on a PC, free transform, go back to my warp, and I can change this again, which doesn't always happen if you are distorting or skewing it. So this is warping's pretty cool in that sense. So what I'm going to do is come in here kind of close, and I'm just going to start following. You can grab these corner nodes, and these are handles. So like an Illustrator, it determines the curve of your path, and these nodes will determine where your path goes. So you can kind of just grab those nodes and then adjust the handles to fit where you want them to go. So obviously I need this curve happening up at the top, and then this is a little longer than it needs to be, so I'm just going to quickly bring it up here. It's being warped, so there is some smushing going on, but luckily paint streak textures are really forgiving in that it looks natural and it's not quite as obvious that they are being warped, because paint streaks are such a naturally flowing thing that it makes sense if they are warped a little bit. So I'm just going to go through this kind of quickly just to give you an idea of how to warp it. This curve's a little too severe for me, so I'm going to bring this in slightly. And it is paint, so it's fine if it looks a little messy or a little off path. At the end of the day, you have to be happy with what you make. So as long as you're cool with where it ends up, that's all that really matters. Okay, so let me just bring this top part in just a little bit more. All right, so I'm just going to hit enter or return. So those changes have been committed, and now I can change the opacity to 100% and we can get a look at how this curve came out. And that looks really pretty. So it looks like a natural paint swoosh that you could have made with a paintbrush. So now we can come in and we're gonna do this one as a stroke, this curvature, and then the tail of the E will finish off with another stroke. So I'm gonna go File, Place, and for this big one, I'm gonna use the abstract texture number 30, hit Place, and let me zoom out a little bit. And just like I did before, I'm gonna kind of angle it. I chose to rotate it this way because I want this darker part to be on the inside of the E. So there is a little bit of thought and consideration when you're choosing which side, because all of these are so varied in color. All right, let's see what that looks like. I'm gonna hit enter and then increase this to 100%, hide the E. Let's see what that looks like. So that's looking pretty good. You can see I've got a little bit of white space right here that I don't really like. I don't like all this little white poking through. So like I mentioned earlier, the nice thing about warp is I can free transform, choose warp, and then everything that I had done before I get to keep. It didn't make it so permanent that I have to kind of start over. So I really, really like that about the warp tool. So I'm just kind of bringing this up and over a little bit more. Feels a little more natural. Okay, so I think that took care of my white space, and that's looking really good. All right, so now we can get into the tail of the E, and then the last thing we'll do is just kind of dress it up with some shadows and highlights to make it seem that much more realistic. So let me turn my E back on, and for the tail, I'm going to use number 33. Place. Once again, I'm gonna scale it down. This time, so like I had the darker blue on the inside for this part, technically I would want to keep that going, but up towards the tail it definitely gets a lot lighter, so I don't necessarily need to keep this dark blue all the way around. Plus I like this end, how rough it is right here, so I'd really like to end the tail with this type of texture. So that's why I'm rotating it this way this time. What this looks like. Change it to 100%, set it behind the one that we just made, and turn off the E. And that looks pretty good. It feels a little too fat down here for me, so I'm just gonna manually adjust this really quick. Warp, and just bring this part up a little bit more, just so I've got a little bit more of a consistent width maybe widen this one slightly. And obviously the E that we brought in as our guide, it was meant to be a guide. So when you start applying your finishing touches, definitely feel free to adjust things, rotate them a little bit to get it exactly how you'd prefer it to look. So this is looking really good to me. So now we just need to go in and add some final touches. And I really like how rough it looks right here. This is a little rougher than I probably would keep it, but for the sake of time, I want to get to showing you the highlights and the shadows. So the first thing we need to do is set a shadow right underneath the E, someplace for it to rest. And I'm going to show you my little trick for adding shadows really, really quickly. So I need to come down here below all of my textures because I need it to sit behind everything that I've done. I'm going to hit B on my keyboard, first create a new layer, hit B on my keyboard, and then I'm going to up the size of my brush to, well, I'll do that in a second. I want to make sure my hardness is set at 0. I want an extremely soft brush for this. So I'm just going to increase this in size. This looks like a good size. I'm going to make sure black is in the front because I want this to be black because it's my main shadow. And then I'm just going to click once. So this is going to make a big shadow. And you want to make sure that the top part of the shadow, because it is so soft, it extends so far up, you want to make sure it doesn't bleed off your artboard, because it'll affect what I'm about to show you what to do. So when you brush it, you want to make sure that it's all contained within your artboard. Next, I'm going to hit V on my keyboard to activate my selection tool. Then I'm going to hit Command T or Control T on a PC. This is my free transform, and now watch this. All I'm going to do is click this top node, drag it down, way, way down, and suddenly I've got a nice little bottom shadow, and I can bring in the sides a little bit. And obviously this part is shorter than the tail, so I need a little more shadow to extrude on this side more than that side. And I can just bump it down with my arrows a little bit, hit enter, and now all of a sudden it's sitting on something. It's definitely too dark though, so let's bring the opacity down to, let's see what 50% looks like. That looks pretty good. Okay. So that part's done. Now we need to add in shadows on the rest of our shapes. And let me just label these. It's always good. Once you start adding a lot of shadows and highlights to label your layers, it'll just make it a lot easier and cleaner if you have to go back and change anything later. So the first thing I'm going to do is come into, this is the middle one. So I'm just going to label this middle. This is my bottom. And this is the main one. Whoops. Main. Okay, so my middle one, I'm going to hover over it, and then I'm gonna hold Command on a Mac or Control on a PC, so hold that button and you can see I get a little icon when I do that, and then I'm just gonna click on the main part of that, and when you do that it selects the entire shape. Next I'm gonna create a new layer right above it, and then I'm going to hit B on my keyboard for my brush tool, and I still want it to be a very soft brush, so we're all good there, but I do need to scale it down a little bit. And I scale the brush down by hitting the open bracket key on my keyboard. So I'm going to bring it down a little bit, and then I'm just going to brush on the inside, because obviously there would be shadows here if this was a real object. So I'm just going to brush a little bit, and after I do that, I'm going to change the blend mode to overlay. And as you can see, if I turn it off and on, it does get darker. So this is shadow 1. So next I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm still keeping this selected, but now I need to add some real shadows. So I'm going to scale this down slightly and very softly draw in some shadows. This one I'm not going to change the blend mode for, so it's going to remain black. And I'm just going to make this part right here where it hits the edge, I'm going to make this really dark so it becomes very obvious that it's running into it and it's behind it. Once all that's set, I'm going to hit Command D or Control D on a PC to deselect that, and I'm just going to label this Shadow 2. And if it seems a little too dark for you, remember you can always change the opacity. And that's starting to look really nice. So now we're going to do this main one right here. So I'm going to come up to the main, hold Command and then click, or Control and click if you're on a PC, create a new layer, and obviously the inside of this would have a little bit of shadow, so I'm just going to add a little bit of shadow here. and change that blend mode to overlay just to give a little bit of darkness, maybe a little bit more, and paint that in. All right, create a nut. Let me label that shadow 1. Add another layer, and maybe this one's just the regular black. It's gonna make it a little darker. All right, that looks good. Shadow 2. And now we need to add a highlight. So I'm gonna click add new, change my brush from black, which you can see right here, to white. And all I have to do is hit X on my keyboard and it'll change it to white right here. It just switches those two. That's the keyboard shortcut for that. So I'm just gonna lightly paint, let me increase my brush a little, right on top, because I'm imagining my paint or my light source coming from over here. So I'll have highlights up here and I'll have shadows down here. So give that a little bit of highlight, and then change this one also to overlay. And that actually looks pretty good. I'm gonna lower the opacity on that one though. Let's see what that looks like. All right, hit Command D or Control D when you're done to deselect. And if I zoom out, you can see it's starting to really get some 3D qualities to it. There's some good dimension going on. All right, so the last thing I need to do is add a little bit of shadow down here. I could add a slight amount of highlights right here, but we'll see how it looks once we add the shadow. And I also would want some shadow down here too, because it's the underside. So let me group all these main ones together so I don't lose it. I'll label this one highlight 1. I'm just holding Shift, clicking, and then Command G or Control G to group them. That way I keep everything organized and straight. I'm going to do the same thing here, group them, middle. And now for the bottom part, I'm just going to hold Command and then click, or Control and click if you're on a PC, create a new layer, hit B on my keyboard. Right now I've got the white on top and I need to switch it to the black, so I'm going to hit X on my keyboard. And I'm just going to come in here. This brush is too big. And I'm lowering or reducing the size of the brush by hitting the open bracket key on my keyboard. And just add a little bit of shadow here and some darker shadows down here. Okay, change that to overlay. And then add one more shadow. So this is shadow 1. And then I don't think I need another shadow right here just because it's starting to get in the area where there's a little more light, but I do need some darkness down at the bottom. So I'm just going to add that in. Okay, and then Command D or Control D to deselect, label my layer, shadow 2, group them, and this is my bottom. Okay. And if I zoom out, there you go. So that's how to create a paint streak letter in Photoshop. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please subscribe. I release a new design tutorial every single week. And also be sure to head over to my blog, every-tuesday.com, for more tutorials and design freebies. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next week.